The fields and hills of Kentucky, in the heart of the bluegrass country, just outside of Lexington, were an unlikely setting for what would become home to some of America's most desperate drug addicts.
Heroin turned me into scum, where I would do anything to get the money to get the dope.
I shot dope from the time I was 15 to 25. The feeling was just instant love, man. Like, you know,
My generation, we were the first group of kids becoming drug addicts in the United States. I don't think the society had seen that before, teenage narcotic addiction.
This is class 1948. This is me over here. I probably got involved in drugs when I was about 11 years old.
By the time I was 17, I was experimenting with heroin. First snorting and then finally injecting heroin. I got arrested and they sent me to Lexington.
For decades, this was the world's most famous and infamous center for the treatment and study of drug addicts.
Lexington was the place that the world learned about addiction. It wasn't just the center in the United States, it was the center for the whole world.
But it would also become the center of a scandal over the ethics of drug research on federal prisoners.
What they were doing was using science to understand drug addiction in order to eradicate it. And this was the only place in the world where they had access to the kind of human subjects that they did.
It was a hell of a lot better to be in Lexington than it would be in the federal prison system. I mean, Lexington was known as a country club. I mean, goodness gracious, we had inmates playing golf out there in front of the institution. We had a softball team that played teams in town. Plus the fact that we had the jazz band.
Throughout the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, the jazz world was plagued by drug addiction. Many of the greatest musicians of the time were users, creating a bohemian mystique around taking drugs.
Lexington had one of the best bands that you wanted to hear because there was a lot of top-notch. Howard McGee, he was there, trumpet player. Benny Green, trombone player. Chet Baker.
Some of the greatest players of all time passed through the Narco Farm. Sonny Rollins, Lee Morgan, Tad Dameron, Stan Levy, Jackie McLean, Red Rodney, Elvin Jones, and many others. It was such a mecca for jazz musicians that some checked themselves in just to play with the masters.
They were great jazz musicians, but at the time they were just drug addicts, you know. But now, looking back, we think of them as legends.
The Narcotic Farm itself was becoming legendary. One Lexington band performed on The Tonight Show. The institution was featured in books, newspapers, magazines, and even Hollywood films.
Morton, how was it down there, Frankie?
Greatest place you ever see, Vancy.
She means Lexington.
I'm telling you. Ball games, great food. I even learned how to play the drums.
You make it sound as if I missed something by not going to jail years ago. It's a prison, no?
More hospital kind.
While the failures of treatment programs at Lexington were discouraging, there was great optimism at the Addiction Research Center. Known as the ARC, it conducted groundbreaking experiments on the causes and effects of drug addiction.
Lexington had the only laboratory in the world completely configured around the problem of drug addiction. They were trying to find out how the brain works, how the body responds, how people respond to the administration of these highly toxic substances. And Lexington was the only place that had a captive population of drug addicts to do these studies on.
Are you John Smith? Yes, sir. Please be seated.
The key to their research was giving narcotics to inmates who volunteered for the studies.
There was this one guy who was high every day. They'd take him out of the main population for 2 or 3 weeks, and they tried different drugs on him. So I wanted to get into that shit.
By the intravenous route, drug effects are detectable within a few minutes.
Participants in studies were convicted males who were experienced enough and sophisticated enough with the drugs that they were experimenting with that they could talk about what that experience was like. And hundreds signed up to participate.
That feels pretty good.
They'd pluck us out of the main population, and we'd go to a separate section. And there were 7 or 8 of us at that particular time being experimented on, with different drugs and whatnot.
What the ARC was doing was informing the medical press about which drugs were addictive, dosages, how to use them safely so that you didn't addict your patients to them. And so the ARC tested all of the drugs that hit the market: synthetic opiates, Demerol, methadone, tranquilizers that were used in mental health facilities, and then barbiturates and minor tranquilizers. Before we were all on antidepressants, a lot of people were on tranquilizers. Big mass market blockbuster drugs like Milltown. Well, were they addictive or not? They were marketed before anybody knew.
Intoxication with barbiturates and minor tranquilizers is similar to that seen with alcohol.
In one study, patients were kept intoxicated on barbiturates for a year.
The subject in this scene was receiving 5 to 10 times the therapeutic dose of secobarbital per day.
When withdrawn from the drugs, some had seizures.
Falls are not uncommon, and the subject
Others hallucinated for days.
10 times the therapeutic dose of
Barbiturates are bad drugs. What the ARC did was establish that these drugs were extraordinarily addictive and have an incredibly painful withdrawal syndrome.
And also physical dependence.
Basically, the ARC classified for the U.S. government what were addictive drugs and how they should be controlled. And don't forget, people were using pentobarbital, phenobarbital. People were prescribing phenobarbital to babies.
Now, after you completed the testing program, did they give you any drugs?
The payoff was in drugs.
Research subjects were paid for their participation with narcotics.
After completing the test, you got so many milligrams of morphine, if you liked it, or either.
The hearings were more concerned about getting drugs as a payoff. Okay, when at Lexington, I was supposed to be going down there to be rehabilitated. This was supposed to be their big drug program.
The payoff not only was in drugs, but it was also in time. You had a choice of earning days on the time that you were doing there, or you could get paid off in narcotics. I choose narcotics.
What did most of the other patients choose, narcotics or time off?
The majority of them choose narcotics. You were dealing with drug addicts. That's what they wanted, mostly.
Yeah, all those guys, man, they were like the heroes of the joint, because they would come into the dining room fucked up, loaded, man,
The people that were being offered these drugs were
pretty well all addicts to begin with. Is that correct?
Everyone that I knew. Okay.
So they really didn't have any choice. It was.
I would say that.
They gave you a choice, but you really had no choice at that
Right.
point.
That's what it
You
boiled
were
down
hooked,
to.
and the government was hooking you.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
A lot of criticism was directed toward the hospital for using prisoners as research subjects. A lot of people felt, well, these are prisoners and you're taking major advantage of them. I never felt you were taking advantage of them.
These scenes show a typical procedure which might be used on the street.
These are things that all these patients had done to themselves before. And they pretty well knew what the possibilities were. And I never saw a patient that really objected.
Several weeks after barbiturate withdrawal, no residual effects could be detected.
The people involved in it were very positive about it. These were people that volunteered to do that and knew what the payoff was. This was, labor management thing. He gave his labor, his payoff was the morphine. It was supposed to be a narcotic research facility. They were investigating narcotics. I don't see what the evil was.
Although this motion picture is old, it shows important examples of several classes of commonly abused drugs.
Back then, that was a different time. Where my head was, where my attitude was, where my behavior was all totally different. I'll be very honest with you. It wasn't until we had the hearings that I began to come to grips with the fact that, I was used. And things that was said there in that hearing kind of like brought it home to me. They used my ass, and took advantage of me, being a young kid and being an addict. I was very vulnerable in the sense that if it's about drugs, I wanted drugs.